Welcome in to Daily Faceoff Live, your go-to source for everything hockey. Live every weekday at noon Eastern.
Welcome in to Daily Faceoff Live. It is June 13th. I'm Tyler Yaremchuk. He is our NHL insider, Frank Saravalli. And Frank, it was a championship Monday in the NBA with the Denver Nuggets defeating the Miami Heat. Tonight, Tuesday, could we see a second straight Florida-based team lose in their final?
It's possible, and I would say the only thing I'm glad about is that whenever the Stanley Cup is handed out, that it goes to a player first instead of the owner and Stan Kroenke of the Denver Nuggets. He had that championship feeling with the Colorado Avalanche last year. His team wins again, of course, in the NBA this time, but the players should always get the trophy first.
We will see if Lord Stanley is getting handed out tonight. A lot to get to on the NHL news front. Today's show, as always, is brought to you by Betano. The game starts now at betano.ca. They got the odds up for tonight's game between the Panthers and the Golden Knights. We'll touch on that a little bit later, but let's throw 2 minutes and 30 seconds up on the clock and get to the breaking news we got this morning. The Ottawa Senators' sale is expected to be coming to a close, with Michael Andlauer being the winning bid. Bruce Garriock reporting the deal is around $950 million US, and it's worth 90% of the team, so 10% stays in the Melnyk family. Frank, you look back at Andlauer and kind of his connections to the sport of hockey. It goes back quite a ways, all the way back to 2003, when he became a co-owner in the Hamilton Bulldogs, then sold that team to the Canadiens, and then brought a separate OHL team back to Hamilton. And of course, they won a championship there. He also had a stake in the Montreal Canadiens that he got back in 2009. A true hockey guy, Frank.
A true hockey guy, and I think, Tyler, this was the preferred choice of the Ottawa Senators by the NHL the entire time, because this is someone that they know well. You mentioned that he purchased a stake in the Montreal Canadiens back in 2009, still holds it to this day. Will, of course, have to liquidate that in order to officially become the owner of the Ottawa Senators. But this is someone that, when you go to Board of Governors meetings in Florida or California or Georgia, wherever they may be, Michael Andlauer is one of the faces that you would see there at the Board of Governors meetings as one of the alternate governors of the Canadiens. So someone that's had a seat at their table for a while, someone that they know well, and obviously now has the resources with, we're told, up to 20 investors that are part of this project to essentially put $950 million on the table. It's an incredible valuation for the league. This is a record. No NHL team has gone for close to this amount. The Fenway Sports Group purchased the Pittsburgh Penguins for, I think, just south of $900 million on a valuation a while back, a year or two ago. So this is a new high water mark for the NHL, and it's incredibly important because it's a small market Canadian team that has to do the bulk of its work and pay players in US dollars. It can be a challenging financial situation, but part of this deal is also with the idea that the Andlauer Group is now going to help fund and put steel in the ground to finally put an arena downtown in the little Breton Flats area in Ottawa, which would make this team so much more accessible to its fan base, as opposed to being 25 to 30 minutes away from the city. So this is a big win for the Sens. This should be a shot in the arm for the market. And it's also a big win for the NHL to not only get this price tag for its other owners, but to also have someone that they are confident will be able to run this team in the right way. If you want to make a chart and draw a direct line of correlation between NHL team success and Stanley Cups, it all draws right back to ownership. If you have good ownership, you have a chance. Just look at the Tampa Bay Lightning and Jeff Vinik and the people that he's put in place. Hands off, well-funded, whatever you need, the Tampa Bay Lightning have gotten it, and there's been plenty of other teams as recent examples to help in that argument.
Yeah, you mentioned a big win for the NHL. I would imagine there's a handful of other owners around the league sitting there going, boy, if that, the small market Canadian team with no downtown arena, if that's worth $950 million US, what is my team worth? Certainly a good sign for the NHL that this deal gets done. Let's turn things to a hockey perspective, though, Frank. What's next in Ottawa? I mean, there's been a lot of talk that Andlauer, the obvious connection is to Steve Staios. Maybe he's the guy who could come in and head up the hockey ops department, or at least be the team's GM. DJ Smith and Pierre Dorion, are they safe for now, or do you think Andlauer could come in and make quick changes?
Well, just on a procedural note, Tyler, I think it's really important to point out that the Andlauer group may not be given the keys to this franchise to run it on a day-to-day basis just yet. They are going to require not just all of the, think of buying a house. You can come to an agreement of sale, but then it might take you 30 or 60 days to actually close on the property. In addition to that, so there's the funding side of it, which I'd imagine, given all the time that's taken to get to this point, is well on its way. But then there's the formal Board of Governors approval that would have to come with that. Now, the NHL's Board of Governors are scheduled to meet next Wednesday. So that would be the 21st. I believe it's in New York City. I did check with some league sources this morning to ask, could this possibly be on the agenda for the Board of Governors to rubber stamp and approve? The answer is highly doubtful. So this is a process that may take some time to play out. Andlauer would also have to meet with the NHL's executive committee, the 10-member committee. That's the smaller, more powerful group of the Board of Governors before even getting to that point. So that's the procedural part. Then becomes the question of what changes happen in the Sens front office. Now, Pierre Dorion and his team have been sort of very confident publicly and in people that they're speaking to that they think they're going to be in charge. I still think that's a long shot. You mentioned Steve Staios. I think he's very likely to be part of this group going into the Ottawa Senators. I'd imagine in a GM role. He was the GM, of course, of the Hamilton Bulldogs when they had all of their success in the OHL. He was also a financial partner and investor in the Bulldogs with Michael Andlauer. So these two have been partners. And you asked about DJ Smith. There have been some rumblings that because of the OHL connections that Andlauer has, that DJ Smith might actually be staying and may be safe. So if I were to gamble, and I am a betting man, I would say that Pierre Dorion will be moved out and DJ Smith would stay. That's the very early reading of the tea leaves. But when you mention Staios, that means the Edmonton Oilers also have a decision to make. And I reported, 6 weeks ago or a month ago when the Oilers were eliminated from the playoffs that this was potentially coming should the Andlauer group win the bid for the Sens, that they would have to say, well, look, Ken Holland's entering the final year of his deal as general manager of the Oilers. He does not appear to have interest in staying beyond that. What is the succession plan for this franchise moving forward? And if Steve Staios plays any part in that, if they view him as part of the plan moving forward, are they going to make a play to be protective and keep him, or are they willing to let him walk? So that's the big question facing the Oilers for Steve Staios, who is under contract.
Yeah, and the sale is now done, but there are still plenty of questions in Ottawa. Just quickly before we move on, Frank, what about from like an organizational building a team philosophy? You mentioned the Lightning and the owner and how important having a good owner who maybe knows his role and can surround himself with good people, how important all of that is. Do you think we'll see the Senators team this summer or next maybe get more aggressive in the way they're building this, or any sort of a change there?
Yeah, I would think that you want to strike while the iron's hot. First off, this team appears to be ready to take the next step on the ice with the pieces that they have in place. You're going to want to get more of a sense on someone like DeBrincat. You're going to want to, make that move if he's not willing to sign long-term. You're going to want to figure out your goaltending situation, who's going to play with Anton Forsberg. But you've got a lot of the positional boxes checked already. You've got your star forwards in Stützle, and you've got your star defenseman, on the way in Sanderson and his impact. And then you traded for Chicker. And there's a lot of really good things going on with the Sens, but I'd expect, especially with the excitement in the market, that you'd want to capitalize on the sort of fever pitch that's around this organization now with the interest of the new ownership group to really hit the ground running and make the playoffs next year and keep those good vibes going.
100%. That is not the only piece of news we could be getting in the next little bit here. Peter Laviolette expected to become the next head coach of the New York Rangers. Frank, this will be the 6th NHL team that Laviolette has been the bench boss for. And I mean, this is a guy who's won a Stanley Cup with the Carolina Hurricanes back in 2006. He's taken 2 other teams to Stanley Cup finals as well. Is this the right fit for the Rangers as they look to step into their championship contender window? I mean, you could argue they were already there, but is this the right move?
So if you rewind back the DFO Rundown podcast with Jason Greger 2 months ago, I mentioned then that Laviolette, not to pat myself on the back, like my arm isn't that long, I mentioned that he was the perfect fit in my view for where this team is at this exact juncture. They got to the conference final ahead of schedule 2 seasons ago. Last year, a disappointing step back with a loss in the first round. And they also have a lot of the positional checks applied to their roster as well. They've got the goalie in Shesterkin. They've got the Norris Trophy winner in Fox on the back end. They've got all these forwards up front that they're loaded with talent. How can they find a way to complement this group, better surround it, and put it in a position to succeed? I think one of the big things missing was the coaching and the in-game adjustments and all that goes with that. I've seen Peter Laviolette up close. I've seen him cook. I covered him for parts of 4 years while he was with the Flyers and saw him take that team that was a 7th seed to the Stanley Cup final in 2010. And in his second season with the Nashville Predators, take that team to the Cup final. So you mentioned it, 3 different franchises to the Cup final, having won once. He's just got, I'll tell you what, an innate gut feel, whether it's the in-game situation, calling a timeout at the perfect time. He gets it. He senses it. I don't expect him to change his style. He's not going to be any different in New York than he was in Washington or Nashville or any of the other stops that he's had along the way. Peter Laviolette is one of the winningest American-born coaches of all time. And I'd expect in New York, where he played his only NHL games and has a small connection to the organization, that this is going to be a great fit.
Just quickly with the Rangers for the rest of the offseason, then what do you think Chris Drury could get up to with that roster? Is it going to be kind of a run it back approach, which with the bulk of that core, or do you think there's a chance we see some sort of a shakeup with that roster?
I don't see seismic changes coming, but I do think that there are some questions to ask, particularly with the players on that kid line. Have you seen the development necessary? Are you interested in continuing on with that group? Will you make any changes? Will some of those pieces, while they still have value, be moved out? I think it's probably a little bit premature to move one of them, but I think at some point you have to ask the question before sort of the book is written on them and you have a real strong idea of what they are, and frankly, what other NHL teams see that they aren't.
Let's take a look at tonight's game between the Panthers and the Golden Knights. We mentioned it off the top. The Stanley Cup is going to be in the building in Vegas as they look to complete their owner's mission of a cup within the first 6 years. But I want to take this a bit of a different direction, Frank. The NHL is a copycat league. We talk about that all the time. So I want to look at kind of how these two teams are built. And as 30 other clubs head into the offseason, let's take a look back at what Florida and Vegas did last summer that led them to this point. So we'll start with the Golden Knights. They really didn't have that big of a summer. Their big move came last season when they acquired Jack Eichel. They got Adin Hill, which at the time was not an afterthought move, but something that was like, hey, you're shoring up your depth. All right. They had to offload Max Pacioretty and Evgeny Dadonov in order to create cap space as well. But there weren't seismic changes last summer. You look at Florida, they made that seismic change. They swapped out Huberdeau and Mackenzie Weegar and a first-round pick. They brought in Matt Tkachuk, and then they went bargain bin shopping in free agency, signing Mark and Eric Stahl. They got Nick Cousins as well, who's played an important role at different points of this playoff run for them as well. So like I said, copycat league, Frank. What could other GMs learn from either of these two teams in the way they were built?
I think you have to take it a step beyond just one offseason, because what really stands out to me about the Golden Knights and the Panthers is their courage of conviction in acquiring players. You mentioned Jack Eichel. Obviously, we have Matthew Tkachuk on the other side. Tkachuk injury notwithstanding, in this final, you've seen 2 American-born players at the height of their powers, which has been impressive to watch. But it goes way beyond just those two guys that they were traded for. It's also going back to Alex Pietrangelo and also Mark Stone. And you think about really how aggressively Vegas has built this team. First off, they're very top heavy. They've got the sort of stars that they have at those positions on forward and defense. And then a lot of their team is basically half of it almost seems to be guys that are making league minimum or just in that neighborhood. So they've made a big bet on stars, and it seems like they've bet on the right ones in Pietrangelo and Stone and Eichel. And that stands out in a big way because it's so different than what that team was 6 years ago, the last time they went to the Cup final. And they're close to fulfilling this goal, that this demand that was put in place by their owner and Bill Foley, which we all laughed at. Stanley Cup within 6 years. I was standing 5 feet from him when he said it. And I was like, yeah, right. Who does this guy think he is? And yet this team has gone on this tear, getting so close the first year. And then now there's only 6 guys left from that group 6 years ago that are still here. And they've surrounded them and said goodbye to some really good players along the way. Max Pacioretty, they gave him away for free last summer. Marc-Andre Fleury, they did the same thing. Paul Stastny. I'm not saying they've always done it the right way. It has never really been a question of loyalty. And I always laugh because one NHL GM in the Western Conference always says, if you want loyalty, get a dog. The Golden Knights have had almost none of it. And yet they've been so aggressive in their pursuit, knowing that these are the guys we want to surround ourselves with, and it's paying off in a big way. And you saw the Panthers too. Like, they were willing to take a step back this season after a 122-point year. They were thinking, we'll kind of be the 7th seed or the 8th seed in the East. They didn't expect to back into the playoffs in the last week of the regular season, knock off the greatest regular season team in NHL history, and then go on a run all the way to the final. So it's been a wild run for both of these teams. And let me remind you, for everyone watching at home, 1 week ago, last year, Jack Eichel was on a boat in Hawaii. The Golden Knights missed the playoffs. And we were talking about firing their general manager, Kelly McCrimmon. That's what their owner, Bill Foley, was investigating. So it's amazing how random this sport is. But when you have the courage of conviction in the people that you are putting on your roster, I just think it can go a long way.
Both these teams have written fascinating stories to this point, and we'll see if tonight is the final chapter in the 2023 NHL season. The game starts tonight, 8 o'clock Eastern time. Let's shift gears once again. Let's get into some draft talk and welcome in our pal Stephen Ellis with the next wave. Just a couple weeks away, or just over a couple weeks away from the NHL draft. Always a pleasure to welcome in Stephen Ellis to the show with the next wave. Last week, we focused on goalies. This week, Stephen, let's zero in on the defensemen that are available in this year's draft. And I want to start with offensive D-men. It's always the sexy pick. Every GM wants to find the next Cale Makar for their organization. Who's the best offensive defenseman in this year's class?
Well, it's a guy that will not come close to competing with Cale Makar, but in terms of offensive skill, you can't go wrong with Lukas Dragicevic, a guy that at the U18s I got to watch really closely. And, he put up 75 points this year in the regular season, another 4 points in 6 playoff games. There's very few guys that can move the puck like him, like he did at the Tri-City Americans. The issue is, and you'll notice a lot of this in this year's NHL draft, he doesn't play a lot of defense. And as a defenseman, and I've said this a few times on the show, defensemen should be able to play defense. The issue is this is a guy that doesn't have the foot speed to get back. He'll rush the puck and then he'll get beat coming back. He's not always great positionally. He's always trying to attack players, but he's taking himself away from his assignment. So that's the big thing against him, but we can't ignore this guy just puts up points like it's nobody's business. He was good at the U18s after a terrible first game and just kind of started to figure it out. So it's hit or miss with him, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's out there getting 90 points next year in the WHL. He's that talented with the puck.
Wow, that's a big number. Stephen, I'm always fascinated by how this defensive crop has really been evaluated. You see the 2 Swedish defensemen, Wallander and also Sandin Pellikka, that have rocketed up the draft boards in the last few months. But when it comes to the best true defender in this draft, shutdown potential, who stands out to you?
So I polled a bunch of people at the NHL Draft Combine over the weekend, and it was almost unanimous. It's Dmitry Simashev out of Russia. And obviously, it's harder for a lot of teams to go out there and see the Russian players this year. A lot of teams don't even have Russian scouts anymore. But, he didn't put up a lot of points, but he played a lot in the MHL. He played a lot in the KHL. He's physical. He can just crush you, and he's just as good as you can get in his own zone. He's 6'4". He's got the size, he's got the brains, he's a good playmaker, but that's not really his strength. His strength is just making sure when you get near the net, he will make your life miserable. And I think that this is someone who, compared to a lot of these other guys at the top of the draft, like David Reinbacher, like ASP, like Wallander, is not going to excite you much, but he's just going to get the job done. And he's about.
So are we thinking like if we're thinking a current comp, just watching the Cup final, like a Radko Gudas type?
Yeah, actually, that's the one that most people come up with. Less of a beard, obviously, but still a guy that you don't want to go one-on-one with. He just
could
shut
get
you
there
down
eventually.
It's still early.
Oh, that is good. That's a nice comp. Yeah, the facial hair maybe not quite there, but the rugged shutdown defensive ability might be. Finally, talk offensive, talk defensive. What about the player with the best chance of just being the best, Steven, the guy who can step in and maybe one day be a team's legit number one workhorse D-man? Who's the best all-around defender in this class?
Well, again, from talking to people at the Combine, it's a lot of people are seeming to go towards David Reinbacher, and I have to agree. And I know Sandy Pellikka has a lot going for him. I just think defensively, there's a bit better there in Reinbacher's game. I think he's good physically, he's good offensively, he's good defensively. And I got a story about him coming up for Daily Faceoff today. And I will point out that he was not projected to be a first-round pick early in the year. Do you know who else wasn't projected to be a first-round pick? Moritz Seider. Another guy that really rose through the ranks in his draft year. Both come from countries that don't get a ton of attention. Now, in Reinbacher's case, he was actually playing in Switzerland, not Austria, but he was playing really key minutes. He's playing 18 to 20 minutes a night. You don't typically see that out of guys this age. So he's been playing a lot of pro hockey. He's just got good. Again, there's not really a huge flaw to his game. And he's just a guy that when you talk to people, talk to scouts who've talked to him, they say he's just one of the smartest down-to-earth players you're going to talk to in this draft. So there's a lot of interest in him.
Is he a top 10 pick, a lock to go in the top 10?
I 100% think so.
100%. Interesting stuff. A lot of interesting D-men in this class. We've talked goalies, we've talked D-men. Next week, we'll get into some of the forwards you find interesting in this class as well. Thanks for hopping on, Steven.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Moving along to our daily face-off inbox question, hashtag AskDFO. Frank, the question, if the Stanley Cup gets handed out tonight, who will Mark Stone pass it to first?
This is always one of my favorite traditions, is trying to chart the path. My prediction or guess would be that it goes to some of the other original Golden Misfits first. I would have to think that Jonathan Marchessault and that group, Riley Smith, William Karlsson, will all be touching the cup pretty early. I'd imagine Alex Pietrangelo, a former captain of the St. Louis Blues, who's received it first as they won their first ever franchise championship, will be getting it somewhat early. And I'll touch on another guy that I hope gets some love tonight, just coming up in garbage time, but we'll save that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's going to run through the Golden Misfits line first. It'll be Stone who gives it to Marchessault, and Karlsson, then Riley Smith. That is my official prediction for you, Frank. If the Stanley Cup is handed out tonight, and if there's any Florida Panthers fans in the chat, they're probably screaming at their computers right now saying, come on, the series isn't even over yet. It's 3-1, but it certainly has that kind of feel. Frank, before we get to our bets, like it really does feel like Vegas is just clearly in the driver's seat here, right?
Well, they're clearly in the driver's seat, but it only takes one game. Matthew Tkachuk said all we have to do is win one game to send it back to Florida and make them cross the country again. So I always think when the cup's in the building, everyone sort of reacts a little bit differently, plays a little bit differently, knowing what's on the other end of it, that maybe the moment, I don't know, we haven't seen that happen to the Golden Knights at any point so far in the playoffs, but maybe the moment gets to them a little bit. It's like a golfer on the 18th hole knowing they have a chance to win. Some people are ice cold, some aren't. There's a lot that can happen even when it seems like a mere formality at this point. But I don't know. The Panthers have also come back from 3-1. I know they're banged up, but I have a sneaky, funny feeling that the Panthers are going to win Game 5.
Ooh, Not bad. As someone who took a bit of a stab earlier in the series on the Golden Knights to lose a home game at some point, I know who who my wallet is rooting for in this one here tonight. Let's talk a little betting courtesy of Betano. The game starts now at betano.ca, and let's flash up what we got for tonight. Frank, a couple of shot props that I have in mind for this evening's game. Starting at the top, Sam Bennett. He was on a streak of hitting his shot prop in 10 consecutive games. That streak came to an end last game. We're getting this at close to even money as well. I think this is a really, really solid spot for Sam Bennett to bounce back. And I love the Mark Stone shot prop again. I've hit it in every game this series, and it's cashed in 3 of 4. You're giving me plus money on this bad boy. He's hitting it a ton with this series shifting back to home ice, and with the Stanley Cup on the line and in the building tonight, I could see Mark Stone's minutes get a bit of a tick up in this hockey game, and that should lead to more shots on goal for the Golden Knights captain. So give me Mark Stone over 2.5 and Sam Bennett over 2.5. They've been crushing it as of late, and you're getting close to plus money on each of them as well. So a couple of shot props for you tonight, courtesy of betano.ca.
So I'm not allowed to bet, but the Conn Smythe odds fascinate me. I mentioned this also on radio yesterday on Sportsnet, so I'm not saying anything out of turn, but I am one of the 18 voters for the Conn Smythe Trophy. And if you look on Betano, Jack Eichel today was 20-1. It's the prohibitive favorite is Jonathan Marchessault, and second is Adin Hill. Matthew Tkachuk is 10-1. I see almost no chance that the Conn Smythe goes to a member of the losing team with how lopsided this series has been and how banged up Tkachuk has been as well. Personally, I see tremendous value in Jack Eichel. I think it's a razor-thin margin between Eichel, Marchessault, and Adin Hill. I'm leaning towards Jack Eichel in my number one spot right now. I'm having a hard time wrestling with Jonathan Marchessault and all the enormous goals that he scored. And then how do you factor in Adin Hill and the goaltending with, you know, how much of that is the system that the Golden Knights play? He's been almost flawless. Man, this is a really close margin. And when you have a deciding game like this, if Jack Eichel were to come out and get a big goal early, for instance, does that sway vote? Like, there's a lot that could happen here. And I'm just saying at 20-1, it's kind of fascinating. In some places here in the US, I saw today it was 25-1. But then I've been reading some prediction stories and people have been saying they're not even listing Jack Eichel. So I understand, I guess, where the odds makers are getting it from. And part of it could just be that there's been a whole pile of money placed on Marchessault. I don't know what the answer is, but it seems a little strange to me.
Yeah, it is a little bit interesting. Certainly something to investigate if you are a bettor by heading over to betano.ca. Let's wrap up the show with a little garbage time here, Frank. It could be the end of the road for call him an iconic NHLer. I mean, come on, it's Phil Kessel. He's at least one of the most lovable guys in the league. Is today going to be the end for Phil Kessel's NHL career?
Don't know, but I think it's certainly I hope if it is that a proper send-off is in order. He's only played 4 of the Golden Knights playoff games to this point, hasn't played since the first round, but the NHL's record Ironman, probably a streak that will never be broken, 1,064 consecutive NHL games. Of course, that record doesn't carry over to the postseason, so it hasn't been snapped yet. I'm just wondering if this might be the end of the road, given how little Phil has played in these playoffs. Still had 14 goals this season and 36 points. So a pretty decent regular season for a guy that made $1.5 million. I just hope that at some point, as the Golden Knights continue to pass the Stanley Cup along, should they win it, that Phil Kessel gets some love, a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, an unbelievable career. And as we argued on the DFO rundown earlier this week, Tyler, maybe a potential sneaky Hall of Famer at some point, 10 years down the road as they continue to go over resumes.
Yeah, another interesting storyline to watch in the hockey game tonight. Heading into the game, it'll be all about the health of Matt Tkachuk as well, which really does feel like it could be an X factor for the Panthers.
Yeah. The Panthers brought Grigory Denisenko and Giovanni Smith along with them on the trip. Those guys have not played so far in the postseason. Denisenko, 2018 first rounder, very minimal NHL experience, kind of tells you how tough the Panthers are in. And Tyler, for whatever reason, when that happens, it almost feels like you get the very best out of everyone else on the team. Their attention to detail goes way up. So going to be a fascinating game 5.
If there are any updates, if there is any breaking news today, we'll have it covered over on dailyfaceoff.com. And we'll be back tomorrow, same time, noon Eastern, with another edition of Daily Faceoff Live. Enjoy the game tonight in Vegas, and we'll chat again tomorrow.
Thanks for tuning in to Daily Faceoff Live. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to never miss an episode.